Welcome everyone to NoDQ&A here on nodq.com as well as the YouTube channel youtube.com/nodq&AW. Today for the first edition in video format, I will be answering some of the most frequently asked questions that I receive, so let's get to it. The first one is, how did you get into wrestling? Well, I've been a long-time wrestling fan. In fact, pretty much my entire life. I'm a second generation fan. My dad grew up on wrestling himself in the 1960s and 70s. He lived back east in New Jersey, went to the Madison Square Garden shows, and then he moved to California in the late 70s and started watching at the Grand Olympic Auditorium. And then when I was born, I remember my dad used to record wrestling shows on VHS tapes, so I would watch all the wrestling events from the early to mid 80s and then the late 80s and on. So, it's been a big part of my life pretty much since birth. Actually, a funny story here is my very first memory in my entire life was I was in my crib and I looked over at the wall and there was a picture of Ox Baker that my dad had put up. Now, Ox Baker is this wrestler from the 60s and 70s. He had the big, scary handlebar mustache and he was bald, and it just scared the shit out of me. And it gave me nightmares for months and months after that. And that's my earliest memory in my entire life, is that picture of Ox Baker. So that's just an interesting story right there. The next question was, what was your first live event? My first show that I ever went to was 1987. It was Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage at the Los Angeles Sports Arena. I believe it was around June of 1987. It was a couple months after Savage faced Steamboat at WrestleMania 3, and about a month or two before Savage turned babyface for the first time in WWE. So I think we were in the cheap seats for that event. So I do remember very vaguely being way up there, and you practically needed binoculars to see anything, but it was a fun time. I actually have better memories of some of the shows I went to in 1991. The first show that I remember very specifically was Hulk Hogan versus Sergeant Slaughter in a boot camp match at the LA Sports Arena. It was around July 1991. And my dad, we were like in the 10th row, but people were standing up, and it was really hard to see. So my dad put me up on his shoulders so I could actually see the match. So I remember that really well. And then I actually saw, I believe it was the second ever Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair match at the LA Sports Arena. They had the first one, I believe, around... It was like September 1991. The first match was like in San Jose, and then the second one was at the LA Sports Arena. So I remember that really well. The next question is, what do you look for in a good wrestling product? Well, I pretty much like everything. My number one goal is to be entertained. I like the storylines, I like the pyro, I like the music, I like the characters, I like the athleticism, I like the whole rock show atmosphere and presentation to the whole thing. The extravaganza, as Vince McMahon would say. So I like the whole package. To me, that's what I like, and that's what I look for as a wrestling fan. And the next question is, who are your favorite wrestlers? I get this question asked all the time. My number one, no doubt, would be Hulk Hogan. I grew up on Hulk Hogan. He is, whether you like him or hate him, when you judge his personal life, but as a performer, as a box office draw, Hulk Hogan is in a whole league of his own. He was the draw for WWE in the late 1980s and early 90s. And even today, if you go down the street and you ask just a random person, like, name a pro wrestler, Hulk Hogan is the first guy that the majority of people will name. And he's a guy that people who do not watch wrestling or follow it at all, they will recognize that name and that persona. So Hulk Hogan, number one, no doubt in my book. Number two, and this is very close, would be Stone Cold Steve Austin, because he transcended the entire wrestling industry in the late 1990s, and he proved that a guy that could work really hard could achieve his goals. And that's the thing I love about Steve Austin, and his whole character, revolutionized the wrestling industry and made it really cool to be a wrestling fan. You could actually go places wearing the Austin 316 shirt, and people, would applaud you for that instead of mocking you. So Steve Austin, definitely number two. And my number three would be Shawn Michaels. Not as big of a draw as Hogan or Austin, but in the ring, in my opinion, there is nobody that can touch Shawn Michaels in a big like Jim Ross said, in a big match situation, nobody could deliver like Shawn Michaels. So, you know, he is the showstopper, the icon, the main eventer. In my opinion, the single best in-ring performer in the history of professional wrestling. So those are my top 3 right there. Now the last question is, how did you start NoDQ.com? Well, I started surfing the net at age 15 in the summer of 1998. And I made my first website. I don't know if some of you remember Tripod, the free home pages back in the late 90s. The first website I made was called DXerps. It was basically just pictures and a listing of all the DX members up to that point. You know, like Rick Rude was listed on there, and Road Dogg, Billy Gunn, Chyna, Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and so forth. So the next page I made was Stone Cold's wrestling polls. It was basically just a whole page of different wrestling polls, just asking people what they thought about certain wrestlers or certain storylines. And then in November 1998, I registered my first domain name. I finally figured out how to do that, and got my own web server and started Stone Cold Wrestling. But then the domain name was wwf.wcw.com, so that just became the name of the site, wwf.wcw.com. And for the news, photos, and polls, and all this stuff, the site got really popular around 1999, and this was before everyone and their brother had a website, so it was something fairly easy to get into back in the late 1990s when not a lot of people were doing it. So, people always ask me, how do you get the site so popular? It's really hard today, but, I built up the fan base in the late 90s, and it continued to grow for years and years. So, and speaking of that, I'd like to thank everybody for supporting the website. And, on YouTube, there's a few trolls here and there, and, people just being assholes in general. So if you guys want to just talk shit, I'll just block you, bottom line. But for those of you that want to give constructive feedback, I really do appreciate it. And for those of you that keep supporting the site, thank you very much. So that's about it for the first edition of NoDQ&A video. Leave your comment. Let me know what you think. Constructive criticism would be great. And we'll see you next time for NoDQ&A video here on NoDQ.com.